Hi class, in this recording we're going to be talking about the dermis of our skin, or the dermis of our integumentary system. One of the unique things about the dermis is that this is the part of our skin that is going to have most of our blood vessels in it, and it's going to be just deep to the epidermis. It's going to consist of a lot of connective tissues, in particular dense, irregular connective tissues. And there's a lot of variation to our dermis. And for instance, in our eyelids, or aka palpebrae, it's very thin. It's about 1/5 of a millimeter. But in parts of our bodies that have lots of force applied to them, so the palms of our hands or the plantar region of our foot, also known as our soles, it can be quite thick, almost half a centimeter, 4 millimeters thick. Collagen fibers are very common within the extracellular matrix. There's mostly collagen within the epidermis. It's the single most common non-water component. We also are going to have a lot of blood vessels within our epidermis. It's highly vascularized. We'll have our sweat glands, commonly referred to as our sudoriferous glands. We have sebaceous glands, which are referred to as oil glands in common English. And we have a variety of nerve endings that can measure temperature or pressure or pain. We're also going to contain our hair follicles and hair roots within our dermis. So this is where hair will originate. Hairs start to grow within the dermis of our bodies. Our dermis is going to help to anchor our face, the skin of our face, to underlying skeletal muscles. Those collagen fibers of the dermis will merge and anchor to the collagen fibers that will wrap around the skeletal muscles of our body, including our face, allowing us to have lots of facial expressions. We find that the dermis is going to have kind of a wavy boundary that's very conspicuous with the epidermis. And when I say conspicuous, I mean that it's going to be noticeable, or you can see it all the way through to the superficial layer of the epidermis. And as we look at this wavy boundary that you can easily see on the surface of our skin, it ultimately is going to form fingerprints. So we find that we have some dermal papillae, which are little regions of epidermis that go up. And then we have epidermal ridges, which are going to be projections of the epidermis down into the dermis. And this up and down nature of the dermis and epidermis, this wavy boundary, serves to increase surface area and make it so that we have increased attachment, makes it so that we have a tighter attachment between the epidermis and dermis. And as I mentioned, contributes to fingerprints and your footprint. Well, I should say not footprints, but the prints on your feet, the friction ridges being the technical term, that it make it so that you have increased friction on your hands and your feet. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. As we look at our dermis, and I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit here. I'll come back to it. So you can see right here, we have this stained blue, collagen fibers are being stained blue. This is a dermal papillae going upwards. And as we look at the fibers here, the collagen fibers right up next to the epidermis here starts as a pink layer, have a lower density, and then the collagen fibers deeper down within the dermis are going to be bundled into larger groupings and have a higher density. And as we look at this wavy up and down pattern of the dermis, where we have multiple dermal papillae and then epidermal ridges or epidermal penetrations, that's what gives us that wavy appearance, our friction ridges, and helps to anchor the dermis to the epidermis. I need to back up the slide here. Within the dermis, there are two layers to the dermis. We have the papillary layer that's going to directly contact the epidermis. It's the superficial layer of the dermis directly in contact with the epidermis. And this papillary layer has papilla, hence the name papillary layer. It has the dermal papilla. And we'll find that the collagen fibers here are going to have a lower density because these collagen fibers are going to have primarily areolar tissue as the tissue housing them. And this areolar tissue with a lower density of collagen fibers allows for white blood cells or leukocytes to rapidly move around directly beneath the epidermis to respond to potential pathogens entering our body. And this papillary layer is very rich in blood capillaries or blood vessels because we need to have a lot of nutrient supply to the stratum basale of the epidermis. Let me go forward a slide here just to reiterate this. So here you can see that papillary layer. I'm going to go ahead and outline it in yellow. Let's increase the thickness. So right about here, in between these two yellow lines, you can see a region of the papillary layer. And then between my green lines, green line and deeper, we have the other layer, the reticular layer of the dermis. As we look at that reticular layer, it's deep to the papillary layer, and it's going to have a lot of dense, irregular connective tissue. Both dense, irregular connective tissues and areolar tissues have a high amount of collagen fibers in them. The reticular layer, though, is going to be responsible for things like stretch marks. And if we take these irregularly oriented collagen fibers and tear them by rapidly stretching out our skin, either maybe you're pregnant, maybe you're having a lot of rapid weight gain, or hey, maybe you're really packing on the beef and you're gaining a lot of skeletal muscle. Whatever the reason for the rapid increase in body volume, that rapid increase in body volume can cause minor tears in the collagen fibers that result in stretch marks or striae that can be visible from the surface of the skin. We also have the hypodermis, and I'm just including it with this recording because where else am I going to include it? The hypodermis is deep to the dermis. Hypo meaning deep. So we call the hypodermis the subcutaneous layer. If you ever receive a subcutaneous injection, a sub-Q injection or subcutaneous injection, I'm thinking of all the vaccines that I've had or my kids have, it's typically going to be to the adipose tissue directly deep to the dermis. And that adipose tissue, it serves to pad our body. It's a nice cushion. It also is going to have, our hypodermis is going to have some areolar tissues too that will help to bind skin to underlying tissues. I'm thinking particularly skeletal muscle tissues. We have a lot of drugs injected into the hypodermis because the hypodermis has a lot of blood vessels associated with it. Now, as we look at the subcutaneous fat, it serves a lot of really good purposes. It's an energy reservoir for our body. It gives us thermal regulation. And since I'll admit I tend to be more of a mesomorph in my body type, and I have a lot of German in my background and ancestry, so I don't struggle with building up my layer of thermal insulation, which is a nice way of saying that I pack on the pounds pretty easily, and it's hard for me to keep my body weight in check. Generally speaking, we find that women have a thicker layer to their subcutaneous fat, and this is because women have lower levels of testosterone within their bodies, so their basal metabolic rates are decreased, and they tend to store more calories in their fat. Infants tend to have a thinner hypodermis, or a thinner layer of subcutaneous fat, and elderly individuals also tend to have a thinner layer of subcutaneous fat. This means that infants and elderly individuals tend to struggle more with thermal regulation or retaining body heat. And I'm thinking of my kids when they were newborn infants and super cute. They would be cold frequently, and they would have to cuddle up on my chest or on my wife's chest, and we'd wrap them up in blankets and just snuggle with them, and it was really enjoyable. I miss that stage of my kids' lives. Or I'm thinking of my grandmother right now. My grandmother is in her 80s, her late 80s, and she oftentimes will just chill in the summertime with blankets wrapped around her shoulders or wrapped on over her legs while she's just hanging out in her recliner because she doesn't have as much subcutaneous fat that she used to. Come on, there we go. And we advanced the slide. So just to reiterate, we have the dermis right here, which is deep to the epidermis. And then we have the hypodermis, which is deep to the dermis. And that hypodermis is mostly going to be adipose tissue, but there also will be some areolar connective tissues as well. That's all we have for our discussion of the dermis and the hypodermis. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.